Hello and greetings from the grammar department. In the previous video, we looked at how a sentence is defined. If you haven't watched that one yet, it's strongly recommended. So now that we have a good understanding of what a sentence is, we need to talk about the two most common of the serious sentence errors that people make when they're writing: run-ons and comma splices. And this is really important. These are not just common errors, as I said, they're serious ones. Because if you make this kind of an error, it reveals something about you, the writer, which is not good. Think about it. What if you hired a carpenter to work on your house, and when he showed up, you discovered he didn't know how to hold a hammer? Okay, would you have confidence in this guy to work on your house? A similar thing happens with writing. If your readers see that you don't know how to use the basic tools, like sentences, they lose confidence and they start wondering what else you don't know. And whether you're a carpenter or an airplane pilot or a writer, it's all about credibility. If you don't have credibility, what do you have? So that's why it's important to be in control of your sentences. And that's why we're here right now. We're going to look at these two kinds of errors, and then we're going to see two ways of identifying them. And finally, we're going to talk about how to fix them. Run-ons and comma splices happen when you have two or more complete thoughts. Two of these clauses that could be sentences on their own, and you write them as one sentence. We drove down to Florida. We stayed in a hotel on the beach. This is a pretty typical example. The writer knows that these are two separate ideas, so he or she put a comma in there. But if you look at it more closely, each of these parts can be its own sentence. We drove down to Florida. We stayed in a hotel on the beach. If this is the case, then you cannot join them together with just a comma. If you do, that's a comma splice. We call it that because the two sentences are spliced together with a comma. Splice means to join two things together, like film or rope or clauses. It's not a very common word, actually. Now, if you make the same kind of error but there's no comma, it's called a run-on because the first sentence runs on into the second. The comma splice is more common. People usually know that they're dealing with two different ideas. And in fact, if you ask them to read it out loud, they usually read the comma as a period. Now, what do I mean when I say read the comma as a period? Commas and periods sound different when you read something out loud. And most people are better at hearing these things than seeing them on the page. This makes sense since written language comes from spoken language. So that's the first method that we're going to look at for identifying comma splice and run-on errors, the ear method. We're going to look at a couple of sentences and I'll read them out loud in a natural sounding way. Listen to what happens when I come to a comma. When you first go to Disney World, it can be overwhelming. I saw Mickey Mouse on Main Street, but I didn't get a photo with him. We say a comma is a pause, while a period is a stop. A pause is short, and it sounds like you're going to continue. When you first go to Disney World, it can be overwhelming. That's how a comma sounds. Now, for contrast, listen to these. I went to Disney last year. It was overwhelming. I saw Mickey Mouse on Main Street. I didn't get a photo with him though. Notice that when I came to each period there, my voice stopped and it also dropped to a lower pitch. I went to Disney last year. It was overwhelming. I saw Mickey Mouse on Main Street. I didn't get a photo with him though. This stop and drop is what the end of the sentence sounds like, where you need a period. When I work with writers who make a lot of comma splice errors, and I ask them to read their sentences out loud, they almost always read them correctly. Sometimes they stumble a little, but then they correct themselves. So with this sentence, they'll do something like this. We drove down to Florida. We drove down to Florida. We stayed in a hotel at the beach. So in the process of reading it out loud, they discover that what they're reading is in fact a period. We drove down to Florida. We stayed in a hotel on the beach. Now that's not the only way to fix it. We'll look at other options in a minute. But that's the ear method, and for most people it really works. Most people, as I said, are much better at hearing what sounds right than seeing it on the page. But you have to read your writing out loud, and this is a really good strategy. Before you turn something in, read it to yourself out loud. Maybe have a friend read it out loud. Read it in a natural way. Don't rush. Read carefully. Read every word exactly as it is on the paper. And pay attention if it doesn't sound right. Stop and make changes as needed. Always do this kind of reading with a pencil in your hand. And by the way, I really recommend with any kind of proofreading to do it on paper. Hopefully if you have a printer, you can print it out. We see things on paper that we just don't see on a screen. Okay, moving along, the second way to identify comma splice and run-on errors is the grammatical approach. This is the stuff that we talked about in the previous video. To review, the subject takes an action, the predicate tells what the action is. So if you look for subjects and predicates here, we drove down to Florida, we stayed in a hotel on the beach, you discover that you have two of each. And as we saw earlier, you can't do that. You can't put two complete thoughts together with just a comma, because each half has its own subject and predicate combination. Each can stand on its own as a sentence. We drove down to Florida. We stayed in a hotel on the beach. Grammar note, as we saw in the previous video, this combination of subject and predicate is called a clause. More specifically, it's an independent clause, since it can stand alone as a sentence if you want it to. This is in contrast with dependent or subordinate clauses, which we'll look at in a minute. Okay, so now that we know the two ways to identify comma splice and run-on errors, how can we fix them? Well, there are three common ways: divide, coordinate, and subordinate. We'll start with divide. Probably the easiest way to fix a comma splice or run-on is to simply break it into two sentences. We drove down to Florida, period. We stayed in a hotel on the beach. It's two perfectly correct sentences. Good solution. But it's not always the best solution. Because, well, if the two sentences were stuck together, they probably have a close relationship. And so we have other methods that allow you to explain that relationship. Next one is to coordinate the two parts. Coordinate means that you're using coordinating conjunctions to join the two clauses. This is a small class of words. There are only 7. The most common are and, but, or, and so. You would choose one of these according to the relationship between the two parts of your sentence. For example, we drove down to Florida and we stayed in a hotel on the beach. I saw Mickey Mouse on Main Street, but I didn't get a photo. You can pay for one day, or you can get a weekend pass. We spent all our money, so we had to sleep in the car the last night. Notice that we usually put a comma in there before the coordinating conjunction. The other 3 less common coordinating conjunctions are for, yet, and nor. As a coordinating conjunction, for means the same as because. We bought the weekend pass, for it was cheaper. This sounds a little fancy. And yet, as a coordinating conjunction, means the same as but. I saw Mickey Mouse on Main Street, yet I didn't get a photo with him. It's a common error that people will make to put both of these together, but yet, don't do that. For and yet are also used in different situations with different meanings, not as coordinating conjunctions, but this happens with lots of words. They have more than one use and more than one meaning. For example, I haven't had lunch yet. I paid a lot of money for those tickets. Finally, nor is used to join negative clauses. I didn't meet Goofy, nor did I want to. I can't speak German, nor can I speak Korean. Notice that strange thing here where we use what's really a question form. Did I and can I? I'm sure there's a reason for that. Okay, the third way to fix run-ons and comma splices is to subordinate. This is where you take one of your proud independent clauses and you turn it into a dependent or subordinate clause. It's sad, but it happens. You use a subordinating conjunction for this, and unlike their cousins, the coordinating conjunctions, there are lots of these. These words also tell us about the relationship between the two parts of the sentence, whether it's time or a reason or an exception or something unexpected. Some examples. Although we spent a lot of money, I think Disney World was worth it. Because we were broke, we had to sleep in the car the last night. I smile whenever I think of that trip. Note 3 things here. First, when you add a subordinating conjunction, the clause can't stand on its own anymore. I think Disneyland was worth it can stand alone, but although we spent a lot of money, can't stand alone. It's subordinate, it's dependent. It has to go with that other piece. Second, the order of the clauses can change without affecting the meaning. Because we were broke, we had to sleep in the car last night. Or, we had to sleep in the car last night because we were broke. Third, when the subordinate clause comes first, you need to use a comma. And there you have it. The 2 ways to identify comma splice and run-on errors, and the 3 ways to fix them. In the third and final video in this series, we'll look at the last major serious problem with basic sentence structure, fragments. So that's all for today. Thanks for watching.